I think it's 3 unmuted, please. Can you unmute? Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Center for American Progress. Thank you for joining us today. We will be getting started in just a couple of minutes. 2 brief reminders before we begin. First, please silence all cell phones and other electronic devices. Second, there will be a question and answer following the discussion. We ask that you wait for the microphone to come to you, state your name and affiliation before your question. Additionally, the books are being sold out in the lobby and they will be signing afterwards. Thank you.
right now. You are like crazy all like right. Yeah, like I just thought my second story like using my side of the hospital, you know, and it just feels like chaotic. Yeah. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is William Roberts. I'm the acting Senior Vice President for Rights and Justice here at the Center for American Progress. And on behalf of everyone here at CAP, I would like to welcome you for this very important conversation with our distinguished guests, who I'll introduce in just a moment, and who are going to lead a very timely conversation about the intersections of LGBTQI plus policy, the community, gun rights, gun violence prevention, not gun rights, gun violence prevention, and how to find purpose and power after tragedy. I first want to wish you all a happy Pride. Happy Pride. As we're in the middle, certainly of a month that celebrates the vibrance and strength of the community, we also know the circumstances that are unfolding around us and some of the context for the conversation today. Unfortunately, we know that around the country, there are new voices stoking old divisions and seeking to wedge new chasms between us based on fear and ignorance, serious threats of violence that have been given voice and support in some really destructive ways, regressive laws that have been introduced and passed at a fairly alarming clip in many states as politicians are seeking to stoke those old fears and divisions, and too many governors are taking the leave to enforce those at the stroke of their pen. All of this leading to a lot of confusion and concern, frankly, in the community, and a renewed environment of animosity and unease that's been spreading. And here at CAP, of course, doing a lot of policy work on these issues. Here's just a snapshot of the issues that we're looking at. Our 2022 survey that we conducted revealed that 1 in 3 LGBTQI adults face discrimination in this past year, a number that's even higher for people of color and members of the trans community. Members of the community are more than twice as likely to be a victim of gun violence than their cisgender counterparts, and they are nearly 4 times more likely to experience violent victimization compared to non-LGBTQ people. And we know that these issues are not occurring in a vacuum. We recently commemorated the very sad 7th remembrance of the horrific Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando, Florida. Places like Pulse that are and should be central and protected for the community as they create affirming spaces and places where folks can feel like they belong and should be safe and fun places where folks can be able to experience the culture, where the culture is centered and celebrated. And we know how important that is, as about 40%, a little less than 39% of LGBTQI individuals report also facing rejection from their families in their past, and search out some of those safe places and spaces where they can find community. And so this was an attack that was really geared toward the heart of the community, and one that earned the unwanted distinction of being the 2nd deadliest mass shooting in U.S. history. 53 people wounded, 49 people lost their lives. I think of in particular, Kyra Murray, who's the youngest victim of the shooting at 18, had just graduated from high school, from my high school, actually, in Philadelphia. Too many of these attacks have occurred, and they too often involve a firearm. It's why the cruelty that we've seen based in the anti-LGBTQ laws introduced in states like Florida, mixed with the passage of weakened gun laws that expand the types of firearms that can be purchased and carried and the places where they can be carried, which is just about anywhere in a state like Florida. And it's why the fight to end gun violence and create safe and loving communities where everyone feels welcome must continue. It's why that this conversation is one both about the circumstances that are going on right now, but also about hope and the affirmation of being able to find communities where everyone can be safe. And so I think it's really important. We're really excited to have this conversation today, especially on a day where the Equality Act was reintroduced on Capitol Hill, a bill that when it's passed, because we're going to work to see it be passed, will strengthen and expand federal civil rights laws to ensure protections for the LGBTQI plus community in all 50 states. And so it's why, again, we're having this conversation today. We're excited that you're taking part in it and excited to have two very distinguished guests here to lead it. First, of course, is Brandon Wolfe, who is the author of the newly released memoir, A Place for Us. Brandon is a survivor of the Pulse nightclub shooting, but also a nationally recognized speaker and advocate for LGBTQI civil rights and gun safety reform. In 2019, he became the first survivor of the Pulse shooting to testify before Congress. And he currently serves as the press secretary for Equality Florida, where he continues his great work. Brandon's going to be in conversation with Chasten Buttigieg. Chasten's a teacher, a writer, an activist, and a proud parent, as we know. He is also an author himself of the 2020 memoir, I Have Something to Tell You. And so I'm going to invite Brandon and Chasten up on stage to lead this conversation. And we thank you for coming to CAP to do it.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you all for being here. This is thrilling. The first time I'm getting an opportunity to talk to a group about this book I wrote. And I'm very grateful that you all are here to share that with me. So thank you.
You wrote a book.
I wrote a book.
And this is your first book.
So wild. It is. It's my first book.
I think it's pretty awesome, right? Can we give a round of applause for that?
Thank you.
And happy Pride.
Happy Pride indeed. What a time.
Happy Pride to everyone. I feel like we should all turn to one another and say happy Pride, right? Happy Pride.
Happy Pride. Yeah.
Pride be with you. Also with you. Okay, great.
It's like a Pride communion service.
Yes. Well, with that introduction, very, very important. However, do you find yourself sitting there thinking like, geez, there's a lot going on right now. And in this moment of Pride, we also want to celebrate. But this Pride Month specifically feels like both the necessary celebration, but also a call to action. First, I want you to just talk a little bit about Pride. What does Pride mean to you? And I want you to answer the question that I know you get asked. Why do we still need Pride?
Great questions. I feel like Pride is really personal for me. And, for those who will take the opportunity to go on this journey of the book that I wrote with me, you'll notice that for a lot of my life, I struggled with the idea of having pride in who I was. I spent so much of being a kid being told that the world was never going to be ready for someone like me, that I was always going to have to find a way to, to assimilate into whatever space I was in, to shave off the edges of who I was, to blend in, to be Black enough for some spaces and white enough for others, and masculine enough to not be clocked in any space at all. And that leaves a young person feeling really isolated, right? And you feel a lot of things, afraid and alone and sometimes sad, but you don't feel proud. of who you are. And it took me a long time to get to a place where I could say I am really proud of who I am. It took chosen family to get me there. It took, I don't want to give away too much, but it took moving over 3,000 miles away from home with nothing but 2 suitcases and a dream of being very gay at Walt Disney World, which happened, by the way. It took all of that. It took me taking a leap of faith and jumping into a whole new world to really understand what it means to be proud of who you are. So for me, pride is personal because it is the manifestation of what I've worked so hard for, which is to live a life that I can be proud of, to be someone that everyone around me can be proud of. So that's number one. Pride is personal. It is about a celebration of self, about a celebration of community. Pride is also a protest. It's always been a demand for justice for all people, equality for all people, a world where freedom actually means something. It's not just a campaign slogan, but it's a value worth defending. That is what pride is for me. And the question about why we even need pride, the people who ask why we need pride are the reason we need pride, by the way, because they can't comprehend a world where who you love is a deal breaker for people. Who you love is being litigated at all times. It's being debated. It's being called political. When you show up into a space just being yourself, people say, well, we want to be careful not to get too political. Don't talk about who you're married to. Don't talk about the journey you've been on to find acceptance in your family. We have pride because we don't yet have equality. We have pride because we don't yet have justice or real freedom in this country. Pride continues to be a demand for those things. And so while I love the, rainbow logos that every corporation does for 30 days and the floats and all of that.
Unless it gets hard.
Right? Then it's like the retail moves to the back of the store and we don't talk about it anymore. Although I love those things, I love the progress we've made. For me, pride at its core is still a protest, a fight for justice and equality.
Thank you for that. One thing I've always admired about you from the moment we've met is how vulnerable you are. Whether we're having a cup of coffee or a drink, or whether you're on national news, you always find a way to root your experiences in policy, to tell your very, very personal stories in an effort to connect with other people. This book, it reads like you're sitting across from Brandon, which I really appreciate. Why did you choose to write a book so vulnerable like that? Tell me a little bit about what that process of writing the book was for you. Was it hard to go back to some of those experiences or memories? And why did you choose to share them in the book?
Oh my gosh. I believe authenticity is the secret ingredient to everything. A lot of people have questions about, politics and campaigns and candidates, and everybody wants to figure out what the hell's going on in Florida at all times. And the answer is really not that complicated. It's authenticity is a superpower. And if you don't have authentic people doing anything, then you're never going to win anything. You're never going to mobilize people, motivate people to want to live in a better world. So for me, authenticity has always been one of the most important traits or qualities to possess. And I chose to be extra vulnerable in this book. Again, I won't give it all away. You have to read it to find out how, but there's a lot of stories that I share in this book that I've never shared before. I never even told my family. They've now obviously read through the book some of these personal experiences that I had, but I chose to be that vulnerable for a number of reasons. Number one, not to steal something from you, but I felt like I had a lot of somethings to tell people in my life. And I needed to be honest with them. In many cases, for the first time, my grandma, I just posted on Instagram the other day, I had never come out to her before. And I talk a little bit about my relationship with my grandma. She has read the book and she gave a glowing review. So if that counts for something, I think it was beautiful to get that from her. So I think that was part of it, was I wanted to be really honest with people in my life about my relationships with them, about how much I've grown, how much I think they've grown. I also wanted to be vulnerable because I knew that there was someone else out there like me who's at the beginning of that journey, who's feeling so many of the same things that I felt. Like the world is not big enough for them, or maybe it's not safe for them to be who they are, or, maybe they really are something to be ashamed of. I wanted to be really vulnerable about that journey so that I could invite them to be proud of themselves too. Invite them not to wait so long to figure out that they're loved and perfect exactly as they are. I wanted the book to be valuable to people who didn't identify the same as me, people who are not Black, who are not queer, but understand what it feels like to struggle to belong, who understand what it feels like to have challenging family relationships, who may have suffered intense grief and loss and are struggling with where to put that and what to do with it. I wanted to be vulnerable, so all of those things were on the table as an invitation for other people to go on that journey themselves. I wrote in the afterword that I didn't write a book because I'm obsessed with thinking I have all the answers to everything. I wrote a book because I want you to know the questions I've been asking, the journey that I've been on, and some of the things that I've learned along the way. And again, I think that vulnerability is really important right now. It was, to your second question, really challenging to talk about some of these things. It was really challenging to talk about stories that I've not told before. Every time I talk about Pulse and losing my best friends is incredibly challenging, but it was important. It was necessary in a time when LGBTQ people need that vulnerability, that authenticity. They need real life stories to know that it gets better from where they are. In a moment where we need that, I felt like it was important not to hide anything, not to gloss over it, not to do what people told me as a young person, to shave off the edges or squeeze it into a box, but to just lay it all on the table and invite people to go on that journey.
I'm really grateful for that vulnerability. A lot of folks think about books as mirrors and windows, the opportunity to either see yourself reflected on the page or the opportunity to peer into somebody else's life. What are some of the things that you hope a reader might see reflected, or for folks who might not necessarily think of this story as an opportunity to see a story similar to theirs reflected, what are some of the windows that you hope folks will get out of the book?
Oh, it's a great question. I think of two really salient examples for me. I think the most obvious is the mirror portion, which is that I hope young queer people, especially young queer people of color, see themselves in my journey and understand that they have every tool in their toolbox to be the most powerful person on earth. There are so many points in my life that I think back to now and I think, gosh, if someone had just told me, you have everything you need to conquer the world, you have everything you need to achieve every dream you have, how different my life would have been if I hadn't spent it so long questioning whether or not I actually belonged in those spaces or had what it took, how much more I could achieve or where else I would be in my life. And I want to give other young people an opportunity to read those things and see the path for themselves. I want them to see the future in this book. I want them to see the power of community. It is called A Place for Us. And what I talk about a lot in the book is the power not just of physical spaces, right? Because physical spaces are fleeting, they decay, they rot over time. They can be tainted by events. A nightclub turns into a tomb and you can't ever go back into that space again. But the real place for us in this world is with each other, is in the community that we create. It's in chosen family. It's in all of those things. And so I hope that young queer people, especially young queer people of color, read this book and see that reflected back at them, and see an opportunity for a brighter future. And then the windows are endless. There are so many things I think people can learn from just hearing someone else's lived experience, seeing things from their perspective. I think about, you probably do this too. I watch the reviews like religiously. I probably should stop doing that. But, I go on every morning and I'm like, oh, did anyone leave a text review? I see all of your ratings and that's fine too, but I want to read what you thought of the book. I want to read what jumped out at you, right? This woman wrote a review, a beautiful review on Amazon. And she said, I am a mom of a trans kid that I am struggling to understand and accept. And this book gave me a moment, an opportunity to see my son in a different way. I wrote that in part for my dad to have that journey, for him to see my life unvarnished, unpolished, without an opportunity for him to interrupt. And I hoped along the way that other people might be able to peer in and see a young queer person of color living authentically and maybe think a little differently about the people in their own lives.
Absolutely. I'm glad you've mentioned this a couple different times, leaving your community to find community elsewhere. I want you to talk a little bit specifically about your journey with the intersection of racism and homophobia and what that has been like for you and why you chose to focus on that in the book, why it's important to share that story.
It's really hard to live at the intersections of identities, especially identities that are marginalized. And it's hard to articulate those things, especially at a time where, again, people think saying racism out loud is political, or people, think saying LGBTQ out loud is
Careful
somehow,
now.
I know.
Careful.
I think we're in a safe space here, but this is literally a place for us. But at a time when those things are seen as inherently political, I wanted to tell people what it actually feels like to live in those intersections, what it felt like as a young person. I was in high school in 2004 when George Bush was running for re-election and, was deeply unpopular and was traversing the country, weaponizing same-sex marriage, right? State by state, trying to pass these constitutional amendments to ban same-sex marriage to juice his presidential campaign with evangelicals. Well, that year, my home state of Oregon banned same-sex marriage. And at the same time, I was in a high school, 1,700 students, and only 11 were Black. And so I was struggling with this world that was debating the validity of my love, the humanity of my ability to care for someone else, and walking through the halls in a school where nobody looked like me. And when you have, both of those things colliding, it feels really isolating. I tell people all the time that the kind of town I grew up in is the kind of town a lot of people grow up in. You know this very well. It's a little cow town. There's like enough stoplights to fit on one hand. Starbucks opened and school was closed for a week. Like, it's one of those towns. And everybody knows everybody. Everybody knows everybody's business. You have family, friends that span generations. And for a lot of people, that can feel really comforting. It's the kind of town they never leave because it feels like home. It never felt like home to me. Never felt like home when there was a white supremacist cell operating in our high school. It never felt like home when, there was an anti-LGBTQ protest that erupted at the end of senior year. It never felt like home when I would come sit at the dinner table across from my very white, very conservative father and try to explain it. And he would look at me like I was from a different planet. Those things made me feel really isolated in the world. And again, I felt like it was important to not just talk about them in the ways that shut people off and they think we're being political, but to be honest about them. This is what it felt like as a teenager to be in the hall with those students and experience those intersections.
I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful that you wrote this book, Brandon. That being said, you talk about your community. What does it feel like to know that this book is about to come out into the world? And I've experienced this with my own book. You don't necessarily have all glowing things to say about the bubbles in which you grew up in. How are you feeling about that? What are you thinking? And what do you hope comes from potentially some folks back home reading this book?
So I read some books to start my journey, and I think it was The Art of Memoir, and actually pulled a quote, typed it up, put it above my desk so that it would sit above me while I wrote. First of all, Chasten taught me how to write a book. So
That is not true.
that is so true. He taught me that you need a clean space that you've nested in order to create. And so I created that space, right? And I had all the things that I needed. I had this cute little IKEA lamp that gave me all the vibes. And I needed this poster above the desk. And the author of Art of Memoir says, if people wanted you to write nicer things about them, they should have behaved better.
Absolutely.
And I carried that with me every single day because I am very honest in this book.
Yep.
In fact, when I sent a copy to my dad, again, who is very different from me, we agree on almost nothing. I sent a copy to my dad. I signed it, of course. It was one of the advanced copies, first ones I got. And I said, there's one rule. I don't want to hear your feedback until you've read to the last page. You cannot send me your, download on every page. I don't want to hear all of that. I want to hear your thoughts once you finish it. So of course he gets 4 pages in and sends me this book of a text message. that's like, oh, and our town wasn't that small and it wasn't that bad. And it was all the things. And I said, again, I have one rule, which is page 4 is not page 200. I need you to make it all the way to the end and then send me your feedback. So I say all of that because I was honest, maybe to a fault, but on purpose. I was intentionally honest. I girded myself for what that honesty would feel like. I feel really confident about putting it out in the world. And what I found is that the feedback has been positive because I'm not the only one who has experienced these things, especially in my hometown. There's one bookstore, independent bookstore in my hometown, and it's queer owned. And the bookstore owner has talked about how my story resonates. There's a woman who sits on the city council, or she did. I think she's rolling off now, but she sits on the city council. She's queer. She has queer children. She talked about how excited she was that this book is a dose of honesty for a town that would really like to not be honest about its history or even its present. So it might piss people off. We redacted some names
That's
just in
also a good
case, but
title.
it might piss people. That's
Yeah.
my second book. It
memoir.
might piss people off. A memoir.
Follow up.
And yeah, we redacted some names, but I think honesty is the best policy. I told you authenticity, I think, is a superpower. And so people might have to just take the medicine with the pudding on this one.
Yeah. I used a lot of pseudonyms in my book, and then I ran into someone at Meyer in Traverse City, Michigan, and they were like, am I this person in the book?
Don't ask questions you
Yeah,
don't
it's
want
like-
the answer to.
I don't know, but that sounds like something you have to look at,
Right,
you know?
exactly.
Are
Are you resonating with that character? Is that what I'm hearing?
First of all, thank you for buying the book. Second of all, I remember what you did.
Exactly.
Okay, so you are currently serving as press secretary for Equality Florida, which we are all grateful for. You're one of the best followers on Twitter.
Thank you.
There are many times I open Twitter, like we all do, get punched in the face by Twitter.
You can say Ron DeSantis. Can I say Ron?
It's just messy, you
It's
know,
messy.
like the algorithm is so messy. Like I open it and it's like, when it's like for you, that little tab, it's
Yeah.
not following, it's like for you,
It's
like
not for you.
baby, you do not know who I am. Like this is none of
It's
this is
to
for me.
upset you. That should be what the tab is. To upset you is
Yeah.
what it is.
I look today, he's decided that cis is a slur.
Right.
Like
That's cis.
Elon
like
Musk has
cisgender.
decided that cis or cisgender is a slur now on Twitter. And I was working on a draft pre-coffee, which is like, that's why you save it in the drafts, right?
Right.
Like I've saved so many screen grabs of all the tweets that I've reported, you know,
Yeah.
with like all the slurs, and it comes back and they're like, after reviewing your tweet, we have found no violations of the safety
Right.
conduct.
How
then I
dare somebody call
tweet,
me
like you've
cisgender?
already done, like Brandon already did it there. Someone did it, retweet. Thanks for being you. So we're all very grateful for your service to Equality Florida. I know it's not an easy time right now. I'm guessing most of us are caught up on the realities in Florida, but I want you to talk a little bit about what you're seeing on the ground, how you stay positive and motivated in a season of politics like this, and maybe just give us a sense of what you think the actual fight is, not the fights that are happening on Twitter or social media. What do you think the real fight is right now?
The work is hard, y'all. Let me tell you that. It's nice to be in DC. The weather may not be great, but it feels a little less oppressive up here. So thank you for giving us that. It's hard. It is a little less oppressive up here. No taxation without representation. It's a very long license plate frame. So yeah, I mean, listen, the work is very challenging. And I do understand what the perception of Florida is right now. And a lot of it is very real. I understand because I go to places like New York or LA and I'm, you know, at an event and oh, where are you from? I'm from Florida. And they, oh, I'm so sorry. All of a sudden it's like blink twice if you need help or something like that. First of all, I can promise you I'm totally fine. We still do have lovely beaches and palm trees. Those things exist and I'm grateful for those. But there's this story to me that's not being told about Florida. And it's part of why I wrote the book, because it's a story of who we are, not just as LGBTQ people or people of color, but as human beings, which is that inherently we understand that justice, liberty, freedom, those things mean something. And that when our neighbor is in need, we offer them help. That when we see something is broken, we work together to fix it, right? There's a little bit of where I talk in the book about what community really means. And I almost got frustrated writing it because I was saying, we haven't gotten where we are today by going it a million different individual paths. We chose to work together. That's the only reason as a species we are where we are today. Progress is at the core of everything we've ever done together. And that for me is the story that is not being told about Florida. The story that's being told about Florida is one where we Bugs Bunny, saw it off, send it into the Atlantic Ocean, and all of our problems go away. And while those things are fun and they're good for Twitter content, what's really happening on the ground in Florida is an awakening, I think. People who were not engaged before, were not plugged in before, didn't understand how things were impacting them, are fighting back in ways I have not seen them fight back before. There's a dad who showed up to a Board of Medicine hearing in Tallahassee. Now, if you tell me 3 years ago, we're going to get 200 people to show up to an obscure state agency hearing in the middle of nowhere, I would have laughed at you. But here we are on the day. The Board of Medicine is meeting in Tallahassee in a conference room. There are 200 people there, and a dad gets up and starts going in on these members of the Board of Medicine about access to healthcare for his trans child. And at the end, he says, I have never done this before. I never imagined I would have to do this before. But this is my child, and we're talking about their freedom. That is happening across the state of Florida. Pride festivals are having their largest attendance we've ever seen. Tallahassee Pride had 3,000 people. It's the biggest they've ever had. Kissimmee Pride had 1,500 people. It's the largest they've ever had. Gay Days had 150,000 people 2 weeks ago. One of the largest crowds they've ever had. We launched a program that was once called the Dolly Parton Project. I think it's gotten a new name now, but it was an invitation for cisgender people.
That seems offensive to Dolly Parton, but
Does
I'm gonna let
it?
it slide.
Now, these people in high drag, they were good.
Okay.
So she might be okay with it. But it was an invitation for people who are not drag artists to get in drag, take photos and post and explain why they're in solidarity with the drag community. We did the first one in Fort Lauderdale. We had a dozen cis women who looked fabulous, of course. We then said, we're going to do another one in St. Pete, and we got 45 people to sign up in the first week before we had to shut it off because we didn't have enough makeup artists to do all of these people. That's happening everywhere. Students organizing, grandparents organizing, people mobilizing, and that turns into real energy for change. That's the story of Florida that I wish people knew more about. The things we're doing are actually making a difference. It's not going to change it tomorrow. It's not going to change it next week, but we are building something real. And to get to your final question, which is, what is the real fight? We're feeling that energy because the fight is for freedom.
Mm-hmm.
We can talk about all the individual fires, gender affirming care, and access to the bathroom, and pronouns being respected in schools, or somebody's face on a Bud Light can. I don't even know why we were talking about that for so long. We can talk about all these things as individual fires, but they're not. They are at their core a fight for freedom. The freedom for people to go to the doctor with their child and get excellent medical advice without needing to ask the governor for permission first. The freedom for people to go to the bathroom without their vigilante neighbor carrying a Glock, peeking over the stall to make sure they're in the right place. The freedom for you as a father to send your kid to a school and know that your family is going to be respected in that classroom, not that books about you are going to be banned from the shelves. That is freedom. And at its core, that's what this country still believes is its most exceptional value. That fight for freedom, I think, is animating people in ways that I had not imagined were possible. Sorry, I'm going to get off the soapbox, but
No, make the soap, make all the soap. You're terrific. I know we're about to turn it over to audience Q&A. So the teacher in me just wants to give you an advanced warning that we're going to do that in a couple minutes. So you can start thinking about your question now. Succinct, it ends with a question mark. So now you've been warned. Last question. It feels like a million fires to put out, and it can feel hard sometimes to keep going. Every day you wake up and you see your humanity being argued about on social media, or you in your professional capacity are having to put these fires out on behalf of vulnerable people, sometimes vulnerable youth who don't have a voice. And we're very, very grateful for all of the work that you're doing. I want my last question, though, to be hopeful. It's pride.
It's pride.
Tell me about a time that you felt alive in queer joy, a time that you exuded queer joy.
Oh, there are so many moments. Okay, I'll give you one. You'll learn more about my best friends if you read the book, A Place for Us, a memoir. But my best friends, Drew and Juan, were the first experience I had with chosen family. And, you know, up until when I met Drew in 2014, I had heard chosen family before. I understood it as a concept, but I'd never actually experienced it. And met them, they changed my life. They really taught me to love myself and care for people more deeply. They helped me to understand what unconditional love actually feels like. And there was a moment, I'm not going to get into the salacious details, and they didn't make it in the book either. But we went on a vacation. That was one of our favorite things, was like, we were so broke and we would just get in the car and like eat potato chips because that's all we could afford, and find some like sleazy motel or sleep on someone's couch in some city and have a good time. And so we went to New Orleans, drove all the way there. It was a 12-hour drive from home. And Drew and Juan got themselves into trouble. I had gone out for a drink and they were back at the place we were staying, and I get this frantic phone call and you know, oh, we've got to go. Okay, so I come back. This person that we were staying with was throwing our luggage over the railing of the apartment. So I knew they had really stepped in it. Whatever they did was terrible. So I'm like collecting my belongings that are now strewn about this parking lot. We get in the car. It is dead silent. For hours, it was dead silent. Nobody talked, no music, no nothing. We get to a hotel in the panhandle of Florida. And I kid you not, Juan just burst out laughing, and we did not stop laughing for 2 straight hours. There was not a moment where my cheeks didn't hurt, my gut didn't hurt. They were so worried that I was offended, that I was upset or hurt. I thought it was the funniest thing that had ever happened, that there was this dramatic, like, you know, Real Housewives thing happening with everyone's underwear flying over the railing. But that moment, we were sitting in this hotel room in the dark. We were trying to go to bed and we lowered the shade, so it's like pitch black in there, and could not stop laughing for hours. That moment of just unbridled, you're with your brothers, something really stupid has happened, and you can't stop yourself from laughing. For me, that is one of the best memories that I have, and I will carry it with me for the rest of my life.
Oh, that's lovely. Thank you for sharing. All right, so we are going to take some audience questions. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand, a microphone will come to you. All right, there we go. Okay.
You do project very well. That's great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, so the virtual audience can hear it. Yes.
Chasten, if I may ask you a question.
Oh, sure.
You know, so I'm curious, you know, there has rightfully, of course, been a lot of attention on the treatment of the trans community and the anti-trans legislation that we're seeing, anti-trans rhetoric and violence. I'm wondering, you know, we all have different degrees of privilege, and as a white man, as a cisgender man with some privilege and power, I'm wondering if you were surprised by the homophobia that you've been targeted with and that your family's been targeted with.
Oh, I mean, that's always there. And if you go looking for the meanness in this world, you'll find it. One of the things I have appreciated about the opportunity to tour the country with my book right now is the opportunity to remind folks in the room to use their privilege, their time, their money, or their power to benefit people, especially vulnerable people and marginalized groups. Even within our own community, the LGBTQ community, specifically white gay men, have to recognize that our wedding rings weren't the only thing that people were fighting for in our community. In fact, many people in our community weren't fighting for them. They didn't want this to be the fight. And so for some in our community, they felt like they reached the top of the ladder, they got to get married, and they rolled it up. And there are people right now who are just trying to get one step up, specifically vulnerable trans youth. And I appreciate getting to use my platform to remind people, one, to ask the questions and do the work. There are many people in politics who don't want to do the work. They don't want to meet with healthcare advocates. They don't want to meet with trans advocates or organizations. They just want to jump into the culture wars on the internet with their opinions rather than learning about what gender affirming care even is. So homophobia has always been part of my life and my story, but you're right. I do get to walk through the world with more privilege than other people. And so for me as an advocate right now, the question is just, how do I use this platform and this privilege to benefit people, even in my own community, who don't get to feel what it's like every day when I get to, take my kids to daycare or walk down the sidewalk and hold the hand of the person that I love because they're still fearing for their life or questioning if they can even crack the closet door open. So that will be a mission that I continue working on. It's something I appreciate doing along my own book tour, is just meeting with folks in the green room before a book talk and getting to hear what they're doing on the ground and in their communities, because those are the stories that we should be uplifting right now. Thank you.
I think we have a virtual question.
Great. Yeah, thank you. We have a question from our online audience. There are many marginalized groups from gender, race, sexual orientation, and religious groups. Within those groups, there are also prejudices that exist between them. How do we focus on unifying these groups to join together to push back on discrimination as a whole?
It's a great question, and I do feel that intensely right now. It sort of dovetails to what you were talking about, which is at a moment when, people living at the intersections of marginalized identities, queer people of color, trans people, especially Black trans women, are experiencing the weight of so many things in the world. There are tensions inside the community between groups. There are people who say, well, why aren't you talking about my issues anymore? I used to be the signature on the email, and now it's not about me. I see pictures that I don't recognize. And I think the answer is a couple of things. Number one, our storytelling, our advocacy has to be grounded in humanity. It has to be grounded in reminding each other that we're in it together, that at the end of the day, we have these different lived experiences, these different perspectives, but we're people. We're people first, and we're fighting to ensure that all people are treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. I think if we can take our ego out of it and focus more on the humanity, we can begin to bridge some of those divides. Number two, I think we have to be honest in educating and storytelling inside of our own community. We can't assume that people understand or know the lived experiences that exist in our community. We cannot assume. I'll give you an example. There are people in the community who are like, yeah, I'm 99% of the way there. I was at the courthouse holding hands, love is love. Transports, I don't get it. Those people exist inside our community, and they have to be educated and brought on a journey as well, just like we would do for anyone else. So we have to be committed to that work of educating. And at the end of the day, I think we have to stay grounded in an understanding that all of these issues are linked by the same thing. I talked about freedom, I talk about it ad nauseum, but the things that tie homophobia with white supremacy, with transphobia, with misogyny, they're all linked to the same thing, this puritanical lust for control over other people, right? This desire to impose your values, your beliefs on someone else because you think you know how to do it better than they do. And I think if we can get to the core of that at the end of the day, I don't know what it's like to be a trans person living in America. I have the privilege of being a cisgender man, but I can appreciate the fight for a trans person to be able to live free, to be liberated, because I know that I want that same freedom and liberation as well.
And by the way, when folks ask a question, if you could state your name and then perhaps what organization you're from, that would be really helpful. Also, it's DC, so I'm sure folks want to, network or whatever.
Hi, I'm Amanda. I'm a recent graduate of Duke's MPP program. So actually, I'm networking with hopes of a job. If anyone-
Boom, see, there we go.
But so thank you for being here. Your point about the fight being freedom. I think that's right, but respectfully, I think that the problem is that's too broad. And I have the theory that what's missing is the more specific issue of what does that mean? And I think there's a need to have a prioritization in our laws of freedom, where does religion fit with LGBTQ, and where do parents versus children's rights So just kind of curious about if that's in the conversation that you're hearing of like, I think we really need to get down to that nuance. Do you think that's happening? Do you think that's harder, more of a difficult battle than this broader approach?
Well, I will say in the state of Florida, there is no nuance right now. We're not having good faith conversations about where these freedoms butt up against one another or how to make them live in harmony. We're having a conversation about whether people should be able to be free or not. And I do think that as we're in a moment of this extreme backlash, at its core, we are having a big conversation about what does freedom mean? And does it actually apply to everyone, or is it conditional? Is it freedom so long as you do the things I say you should do or live the way I say you should live? I'd love to get to a place, especially in Florida, where we are having a good faith conversation about how to live in harmony with one another, how to build cohesive, multi-generational, multi-faith, multiracial democracy. But I don't think that's the battle that's being waged, certainly in the state of Florida right now. And I would really look forward to the day where we could, in a legislative hearing, be talking about how to expand freedom to be more inclusive rather than simply scratching and clawing for the basics of, I just want to be able to send my kid to a school and not have books about one community ripped off the shelf and not any others.
Let's go back there.
Hi, my name is Mike Sozan. I work here at CAP. Chasten, first of all, thank you for your tremendous leadership for the past many years. Brandon, thank you for your leadership as well, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
Question about Florida. I mean, it seems that there was some good progress over the past couple decades on people's rights and expanding them. But obviously that we've seen a big reversal over the past several years, to the point now where it seems that guns have more rights than queer people do in Florida.
You're not wrong about that.
And so as you see this reversal in Florida, and I'm sure you deal with policymakers, lawmakers there, including ones who have reversed their positions and are going in the wrong direction now, how do you enter a conversation with them, or how do you try to reason with them as you see this backsliding?
Well, number one, there are some that don't care to reason. And I think we have to be honest about that. There are a good portion of lawmakers and politicians, certainly in the Florida state legislature, who care about wealth, fame, and power and access to those things. And they will do whatever and say whatever in order to get access to those things, right? To trend on Twitter or be on, whatever their favorite cable news show is, or send another fundraising email. That for them is the game. And so there's not a reasonable conversation to be had about the humanity of people when the humanity of people is a bargaining chip to some people. But there are some, I would say, and certainly in the broader population, there's a real conversation to be had about the humanity of our state and how do we get back to a place where, we're talking about tax policy and not, struggling over whether or not someone should be able to use the bathroom. And what I've found is, there's no one magic conversation. There's no one thing that's going to change everybody's mind, but there are some things that cut through. Number one, we always know that having a conversation about the economy is going to help to get through some doors that might not normally be open. Someone really cares if they're in a tourist district, what's happening if Marriott and Hilton are struggling to fill rooms because Florida's reputation has created damage to their bottom line. That's something they want to talk to somebody about, right? It suddenly has a real impact on the people in their district. And I have said this all along, that storytelling is our secret weapon, that throughout the existence of LGBTQ people in their civil rights movement, being able to tell stories about who we are and be honest and transparent and authentic has been the thing that has propelled movement on that issue in this country. And I think we have to continue to engage in that. I'll tell you how I think it's showing up now as an example. We know that during the fight for marriage equality, people standing on courthouse steps, holding hands, love is love, that changed people's minds. People seeing shows like Will and Grace and others, seeing queer people existing in public changed people's minds because they saw them as human, not as this ideology or shadowy figure in hiding in the closet, but as their neighbor, as their doctor, as their, family member. And that changed people's minds. The very same thing is happening with trans people right now. Even as there is this backlash and hysteria about all things LGBTQ, there was just a poll that came out recently that said that people were asked about using the bathroom, trans people using the bathroom. And a majority of people polled said, I think we should just let them use the bathroom and leave them alone. That's because we've been having a conversation about it. And people know perhaps trans people personally, or they've seen them around for the first time in their entire lives. That has given us an opportunity to share these stories. Storytelling is always going to be our secret weapon, our way in the door. When you can humanize people, you take away the ability to strip them of their rights, their civil liberties, because all of a sudden they're not that ideology or shadowy ism. They're just the person sitting in front of you who want to be treated the same as you are.
Speaking of storytelling, Brandon wrote a book and it's on sale in the lobby today. Last one? Are we done? Virtual question. Last one. We're done. Yes, no. Who's on first? Okay. We're done. We're good. Okay. It's like, save me here.
My name is Nick Wilson. I have the pleasure of leading the gun violence prevention team here at CAP. First, again, thank you to Brandon and Chasten for the excellent conversation. One more round of applause. I also want to thank everyone who braved the rain to join us in person, and the many of our supporters watching online and hopefully staying dry as well as we discuss these important but heavy issues. Also want to thank the events team for another wonderful, seamless event. Earlier in the opening, Will Roberts shared some sobering statistics and challenges facing the LGBT community, as well as the majority of Americans that want action to to reduce gun violence. I'm going to talk a little bit about the solutions we're working on here at CAP. Every day, we think about how we can strengthen our gun laws and leverage investments in our community to address the root causes of violence. These policies should not be new to you all, and they're basic: expanding background checks and requiring a permit to purchase, making it harder for individuals who want to kill to gain access to firearms, requiring safe storage of firearms to prevent child access and gun thefts, increasing funding for community violence intervention programs in our under-resourced and over-policed communities. And we need to reinstate the assault weapons ban to reduce the number of casualties when prevention and intervention fails. There's a long list of policies that we're working on to reduce gun violence, but I want to highlight one policy that seems not only relevant, but originated in this building. The Disarm Hate Act would prohibit individuals who have been convicted of a misdemeanor level hate crime from buying or possessing guns. It's simple. People convicted of a hate crime shouldn't have guns. Whether it's a gay nightclub like in Club Q in Colorado Springs, the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, a Bible study at historic African-American church in Charleston, a Walmart in El Paso, Texas, supermarket in Buffalo. I could go on, but sadly, we all know that hatred and easy access to firearms are a deadly mix. We must confront the racist rhetoric, which often leads to violence. Just this morning, I was at an AAPI Against Gun Violence convening where Congressman Lucy McBeth, an incredible survivor and GVP champion, challenged us in the room to, quote, speak on behalf of those who are unseen, but still suffering day in and day out by the hateful rhetoric and hateful actions of those who simply will not allow everyone in this country to live free as we're all intended to live. We know that in order to pass and strengthen and implement gun laws to prevent these horrific incidents, we must grow, strengthen, and diversify the gun violence prevention movement in order to build the necessary political power. I also think it's important that we take a moment to recognize the progress we've made and the recent successes, thanks to the dedication of advocates, and especially for survivors, for sharing their stories, even it might bring up pain as they do so, and the young people for showing up to vote and holding both elected officials and fellow advocacy organizations accountable to do more. This Sunday is the one-year anniversary of the Bipartisan Safer Community Act, the first meaningful gun law in 30 years. It was an honor for me to be in Hartford, Connecticut last Friday, where Senator Murphy, along with some friends in the room like Everytown and Giffords, convened leaders of the GVP movement and federal champions like the Education Secretary and President Biden to celebrate this win, to ensure that the policies are properly implemented, the money well spent, and we build momentum for the next federal gun law. Billions of dollars in investments in our youth were included in this bill, including addressing social emotional needs, expanding access to after-school programs, substantial investments in mental health, and building the mental health professionals pipeline, as well as more money for community violence intervention. There are also 5 new gun policies included in this bill, making it harder for domestic abusers to access guns, finally making gun trafficking a federal offense, and forcing individuals who sell guns for profit commercially to register as a licensed dealer. With large states with high levels of gun violence like Texas and Florida loosening gun law regulations and supplying guns to neighboring states and countries with strong laws, we need Congress to act. Bipartisan Safer Community Act is a strong start, but until they pass more laws, we will continue to have families and communities devastated by gun violence. We must do a better job of supporting gun violence survivors. Supporting survivors is a cost-effective public health approach to increase accountability while addressing the root causes to make our communities safer. It's also a moral imperative because survivors have a right to basic services to help them heal after violence. But thanks to bureaucracy and structural racism, this often isn't the case. In a recent executive order, President Biden directed members of his cabinet to develop a proposal for how the federal government can better support communities after a mass shooting. Creating a FEMA-like response to mass shootings is an important step forward, and CAP is excited to provide input on how this should look on the ground. Uvalde and Buffalo are still hurting a year later, feeling left behind. Brandon's powerful memoir shines a light on the long-term impact of a shooting on both individuals and entire communities. We also need to support the survivors impacted by everyday gun violence in our communities. Over the holiday weekend, there were mass shootings in Philadelphia, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Milwaukee, Baltimore, and sadly many more. For many of these victims, especially people of color, they might not have access to services and compensation they're entitled to. And since we're all here because Brandon is an excellent writer, I will quote from his op-ed in The Guardian last November following the attack on Club Q and the LGBT community in Colorado Springs. Quote, "It's the Black trans women who have been under assault not just for the past months, but decades. And as we saw with the trans woman who helped take down the Club Q shooter with her high heel, they're willing to put their bodies on the line to defend us. The challenge for the rest of us is simple. Are we willing to do the same for them? It's a privilege to work at CAP where we don't look at these issues in isolation. Building a society where Black trans women are safe and can thrive requires examining LGBT hate, racism, misogyny, and yes, easy access to guns, thanks to weak gun laws. Thank you all so much for coming today. Brandon will be in the lobby to sign books, which are available for purchase. You can also buy copies of Chasten's books that are already signed. And as a way to show allyship in the spirit of pride, I encourage you to buy books, extra books, and make sure they're donated to a local LGBT center. I hope you'll join us for snacks and drinks. Thank you so much.